afternoon and for coming along to Marxism. And I guess I just want to start off by saying that, this whole meeting is pitched really in the spirit of comradely discussion and debate. And I know that there might be some people in the room who might look to aspects of Stalinism. There has been a resurgence of ideas and so on. And I hope that we can have a really healthy and robust discussion around this in the discussion. But, really what I'm here to say is that what was Stalinism? No spoiler alerts or anything, but really it was an authoritarian class society based on the suppression of workers' struggle, workers' rights, attacks on oppressed groups, and attacks on minorities, attacks on political dissent, work and prison camps, and a system based on global imperialist competition and an arms race. So, sorry, I'm really not good for spoilers. Whenever I tell you about a film I've watched or something, I usually give away the ending before we get there. But so I'm going to say, no, I don't think there's anything cool about Stalinism. And I'm shameless about saying that. I'm not just talking about Stalin's reign from 1928 to 1953. We're talking about the whole Soviet Union system from 1928 on till its fall in 1991, but also the politics of other communist countries. We might talk about China and Cuba, which again we'll maybe bring up in the discussion. I'm going to specifically focus on Russia for most of this talk. And while a lot of Stalinist countries will claim to be a continuation of the revolutionary struggle of 1917, really what I'm going to argue is that Stalinism was actually a counter-revolutionary movement against that, and it was a break from it. And again, that while some Stalinists today and in Britain will call themselves Marxist-Leninists, actually again, Stalinism is a break from the genuine idea of Marxism and Leninism, the idea of workers' self-emancipation from below, socialism from below. And that's really the tradition that we stand in the Socialist Workers' Party. So really, no, there's nothing cool about Stalinism and nothing socialist or progressive about Stalinism. I'm going to make my words mixed up. Stalinism in any way. So, why is it then that there's this resurgence of interest and ideas around Stalin? Because there is, isn't there? We've seen a number of, young activists, for example, around the Young Communist League, really drawn to and interested in Stalin's ideas. And, they've had really good presences on some of the protests, for example, the COP26 protest in Glasgow or the Manchester protest against the Tory party conference last year. They had, quite impressive delegations. But actually, some of the politics within this are actually very scarily, I would say, pro-Stalin. When I've been looking online and, maybe people are familiar with it here, there's like Tanky TikTok, there's Stalinist meme pages, and some of the Tanky TikTok really comes out in defense of Mao, reclaiming the word TikTok, glamorizing Stalin, holding him up as a hero who's advanced socialism and so on. Now, others on the left might hold illusions with what they might call socialist states. They might argue that Stalinism was maybe a more progressive form of, in some ways, than Western capitalism. For example, Kirsten Godsey, who's an academic in the US, she wrote a book called Why Women Have Better Sex Under Socialism and Other Arguments for Economic Independence. And in it, she really does argue that in some way, women in what she calls the Eastern Bloc state socialism, that's what she labels it, somehow had more liberation than women under Western capitalism. And later I'm going to describe how this is very far from the truth. Now, I think also, though, some sections of the left might look to Stalinism and the Soviet Union and maybe see it as a counterweight to the Western imperialism, supporting struggles against colonialism and for national liberation and so on. But we have to be true about the facts. Stalin was not an anti-imperialist, but actually an imperialist competitor. And the Soviet Union supported, for example, the founding of Israel in 1948. It opposed Algeria's national liberation struggle in the 1950s. And also, the Soviet Union also supported resistance against the revolutionary struggle in China, irony of ironies, Greece, Italy, European countries post-1945, Iraq, 1958 to 59, and France, the fantastic rebellion in 1968 in France. And then we also have Spain in 1935. We know about the heroic resistance against Franco and against fascism. Well, actually, tragically, Stalinists ended up aligning themselves with the bosses in Spain against the revolutionary struggle, and actually ended up holding back the potential to beat the fascists. They said they needed a popular front with the ruling class, and that was the way to fight fascism. But what that meant was, as soon as they aligned themselves with the bosses, well, when the workers were on strike, they had to side with the bosses and oppose the workers on strike. So, if Stalinism is really not cool and really not socialist, then again, why is it, do you think, that at the moment some people, especially maybe some young activists, might be looking to Stalinism? What is it about it? And I think there's a number of reasons. I think the first one is really, it's about looking to an alternative of reformism when we see the failure of the project around left reformism, for example, in the Labour Party around Corbyn. We saw a huge surge and a movement into the left around Corbyn, which was just, absolutely fantastic. We've just heard from Corbyn now and so on. We still have different politics from Corbyn in the SWP and so on, but you do see a big rise of the left. But actually, that project we know now has ultimately failed, and we see the nature of the Labour Party at the moment. It's turning more to a graveyard of activism rather than the face of the fight back. And so then where do you look to? We also, have, unfortunately, not a big enough anti-Stalinist revolutionary left, like the Socialist Workers' Party. We should be much bigger. We should be much broader. That's why we want you to come along and to join us and get stuck in the struggle. And that is part of it as well. Where else do people look to? And in that context, actually, Stalinist organizations can become and Stalinist ideas can appear as anti-imperialist, and they can appear as like a more radical form of what we'd call socialism from above, rather than socialism from below. The Labour Party and Corbyn's project was also socialism from the above, that somehow it can be implemented from the top of society through parliament and so on. But this can be seen as perhaps another, maybe even more militant version of socialism from above. Also, I think maybe memory, there isn't necessarily the same memory of the horrors of what happened in the Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc for people. There's more distance. I think we can now maybe also see China and Cuba in particular as being, countries that we can support as being maybe perhaps anti-imperialist and anti-West. And then we also, I think, and this is probably one of the main ones, and I've already mentioned it, is anti-imperialism, isn't it? The USA has dominated globally since the end of the Cold War. And so naturally it will be seen as, the number one global enemy, and, it really should be for those of us who oppose imperialism, Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, Syria, and so on. We're opposed to all these wars. And, I think while in the SWP, I remember I was active around the fight back against the war in Iraq. And, yes, I was Bush's world's number one enemy. Yes, US, Britain and the West, we have to resist it and fight it, but we can't say that there isn't other imperialist competitors in the world, and Russia and increasingly China are part of that global stage of imperialism. So while we do support resistance in these countries, I think that we have to say is ultimately we would say, and I'll come on to it later, neither Washington nor Moscow, we're opposed to all imperialists. And actually, in a way, the way to fight imperialism is to, fight your own country at home and in solidarity with those fighting back against their own rulers. And I think we're seeing this at the moment very acutely, aren't we, in the war in Ukraine. We see how Ukraine is being used as a proxy between, the West and then Russia and the growing alliance with China. And we can come into this more in the discussion. Right, so I'm going to talk now a little bit more about the history and the realities of Stalinism. So again, today, within Stalinist organizations, we might talk about Marxism and Leninism, and we might talk about that, maybe Stalin only targeted the rich peasants or the landowners and so on. But actually, in reality, that was very far from the truth. Stalin attacked and swept away all the progressive gains, which were many, from the 1917 revolution. And if you've attended the course earlier on in the day, you hopefully will have been hearing about, the tribunes of the oppressed and the immense gains that were made during 1917, and I'll come into it a bit as well in a moment. So they swept away all the progressive gains. They murdered those revolutionaries who'd been involved at the heart of the revolution of 1917, including most of the leadership of the Bolshevik Party. These activists were purged. They were labeled as fascists. They were sentenced to death. They were tortured, murdered by secret police, sent to freezing labor camps, exiled. They were purged as fascists, as traitors, and these people who were murdered, they made up 90% of the Bolshevik organization, of the leadership of the organization during 1917. So if you think, they were quite young as well at that time. How could these young fascists lead a workers' and peasants' revolt and revolution? You know, it just doesn't quite add up if they were all a load of fascists. I don't think they'd be doing that and calling for the need for socialism and for women's liberation and so on. And what Trotsky, the revolutionary Trotsky, called Stalin's massacres, he called them a river of blood. And he himself, he was exiled in Mexico in 1929 by Stalin, and then he was later murdered by a Stalinist agent in 1940. But you know, the rivers of blood that we talk about with Stalinism goes way beyond the purges of the Bolshevik leadership. You know, we also are talking about what was forced industrialization that was going on. So what they had was quite a lot of what we call labor camps. They called them gulags. 20 million people passed through these gulags. 5 million were political prisoners. There were 470 labor camps within Stalinism. They were absolutely huge. So at the height in 1950, there were over 2.5 million people suffering, and millions died. And 26 million people were imprisoned under Stalin's rule. You know, it doesn't sound like socialism, does it, if we talk about socialism being about human emancipation and liberation. And, you know, there was repression of workers, repression of peasants, and it led to famines across Ukraine and much of Eastern Europe. So all this was done, again, with the aim of mass industrialization to compete with the West on a global scale. But I think that we also have to see these prison camps and the gulags was part of a much broader state repression. And this, again, comes back to the class nature of Stalinism. And this really was through what Stalin wanted to drive through, which was forced industrialization. And they used, the only thing they could really go for in order to force this industrialization was repression. You think within a free market system, don't get me wrong, it's not like it's any better. It's, you know, we're for neither Washington or Moscow, but the free market itself disciplines the workforce, drives down workers' wages, says we need to keep up the profits and so on. Within Stalinism, the state needed to enforce that level of discipline on the workers. So there was one-man management, there was subordination to management in the workplace, and they removed the right of workers to self-organize. There were trade unions, but they were attached to the state. So they were very much owned and controlled by the bureaucracy, and workers had no collective bargaining rights. There were things called labour passports. And if your labour passport wasn't filled in for a voluntary working day on a Sunday, then that means you could go to prison, okay? Or be sacked. And Stalin also used this counter-revolution to attack oppressed groups. You know, the family was seen as really central to sustaining the state and reproducing the workforce that was needed in order to have this mass industrialization. So women's rights, LGBT plus rights were also then seen as a threat to that drive to, you know, produce more people. So 1934 saw homosexuality being recriminalized. The revolution of 1917 had actually overturned anti-sodomy laws, which existed in Tsarist Russia up until the revolution. And then 1936, Stalin banned abortion, whereas during the revolution in 1920, the revolutionary government had legalized abortion, which again is quite incredible to think about that revolutionary society if we see what's happening in the US and where we're at today. So not only that, within Stalinist Russia, women were awarded medals for having multiple children, and people who were single would be penalized. And the joys of motherhood were promoted from the state, just to let women know how lucky we are. So, you know, also, but on top of that, it wasn't just about the sexist ideas at the top of society. Women also played a marginalized role within society. They were still expected to do all the same housework, the cooking, the cleaning, and so on. In fact, it was your duty to, you know, the communist state to do this. And then also you had to go to work as well. So the double burden that we talk about within the West and Western capitalism, within free market capitalism, existed under Stalinism as well. So, you know, socialism was, Stalinism was not socialism. It was not about liberation. It was not about anything that I think is cool. It was about a bureaucratic class enforcing and repressing the masses as it increasingly attempted to compete on a global free market stage. So, how did we get to this point? And this is where, if you've been involved in the course this morning, you know, you might hear some of the same things coming up again. But, you know, I think repetition isn't a bad thing. So, you know, I think what we have to talk about is how did it get to that point? You know, 1917, that revolution really did give us a glimpse. And I think it's important that we do look to that glimpse of what socialist revolution could look like. And, you know, it wasn't about a few people, with guns seizing power on behalf of the masses. It was, in the words of Trotsky, about the forcible entrance of the masses into the realm of rulership over their own destiny. You know, that's the idea that ordinary people, working people, oppressed groups of people, peasants, soldiers, and so on, they should have a say in what their world looked like and what society should look like. And that's what the Russian Revolution gives us a glimpse of. For a very small amount of time, workers seized power in Russia and began the process of running society in the interest of people, not profit. And the foundation of this new society, the democracy that we see within it, far outstripped any bourgeois democracies that you'd see anywhere else in the world. And this is because they were based on something called Soviets. Now, they take the word into the Soviet Union. No. Soviets were about workers' councils. They were mass workers' councils that sometimes stretched across different industries. So, for example, in Petrograd, in the run-up to the revolution, the Soviet encompassed lots of different workplaces. It had 1,200 delegates to it, and they helped to literally coordinate and run the city. And so it's about, again, mass workers' democracy on a scale that, you know, we can get a small glimpse of it when we go on picket lines, and we can start to see how workers can begin to self-organize in that way. So the revolution really brought about an explosion of human potential, a thirst for knowledge, reading, theater, art, education. The American journalist John Reed was visiting Russia and ended up writing a fantastic book about it called 10 Days That Shook the World. And he wrote that all of Russia was learning to read. The illiteracy rates before the revolution were very high. But they were reading politics, they were reading economics, they were reading history because they wanted to know. They talk about, revolutionaries going up to some of the trenches on the war with pamphlets, and the soldiers being eager to take them and read them and saying, have you got something for us to read? We just want something to read. But it wasn't just, an intellectual revolution or revolutionary ideas. It also was, again, about liberation of oppressed groups. Tsarist Russia was famously backwards around issues of women's rights. However, through the revolution, women won historic rights. They won the right to divorce. They won equal pay. They won the vote. They won abortion rights. Homosexuality was decriminalized. Alexandra Kollontai, who's the person I wrote the book about, she was a leading member of the Bolsheviks at that time, and it was absolutely central to helping to fight for and win some of these fantastic changes. Now, also, though, it would take up the issue of racism. You know, Russia was deeply anti-Semitic, but what you see is that under Tsarist Russia, Trotsky, who was a Jew, was a leading member of the Bolsheviks, chair of the Petrograd Soviet, and later became leader of the Red Army. Also, the revolution liberated oppressed nation-states under the Tsar. For example, it liberated Ukraine. And the revolution also brought an end to the First World War. So, this is what we talk about when it's cool. This is what we're fighting for when we talk about socialism, when we talk about workers' revolution. Compare this to the description of the revolution written by the Young Communist League. Okay? Bolshevik Red Guards took control of the Winter Palace and crushed the anti-communist White Guard. Whereas the February Revolution saw the end of Tsarist rule, the October Revolution sought to unite Russia under one ideology, Marxism-Leninism. Okay, there's factual errors there, but also it's dry, it's boring, it's top-down, and it's got nothing to do with workers' self-emancipation, about human liberation, about the fantastic victories that were made. And it wasn't about imposing a Marxist ideology onto the workers. Working class people themselves were coming to these ideas through struggle, and yes, alongside and working with revolutionary socialists in the Bolshevik party, okay? The revolution was in reality about growing tensions within the working class and the peasantry that had been bubbling up and boiling since the outbreak of the First World War in 1914. And by February 1917, when revolution broke out, there was famine across Petrograd. There was hardly any flour left. There was no bread. There was poverty. There were peasants who were conscripts dying on the front. And people started to say enough is enough. And what you saw on International Women's Day was women textile workers went out on strike. And they actually went out on strike. The Bolsheviks actually were saying, no, you don't go out on strike yet. We're not quite ready. And they said, no, we're going out on strike. And there was women Bolsheviks in there leading the struggle. And they ended up bringing Petrograd to a standstill. The men came out, the workers joined them as well. And their key demand was bread and peace. They needed food and they wanted an end to the First World War. Within days, the city was brought to a standstill with a general strike and the Tsar had gone. However, once the Tsar had gone, this opened up a period in Russia where there was a contest to see where would the revolution go. A provisional government was put in place where it was made up of kind of liberals and more moderate socialists, so some of the bosses and so on. However, in workplaces across the country, you start to see the workers' councils and the Soviets and all the democracy really starting to grow. And as I mentioned before, the Petrograd Soviet reached a height of 1,200 and controlled the society. So this is what Lenin, the leader of the Bolsheviks, was saying. This was a period of dual power, where the bourgeois was controlling the provisional government, but the workers really were controlling the workplaces and increasingly controlling the cities and the Soviets. So this situation was unstable. Who would win out? How would this, where would it end? Now, increasingly, the provisional government, who had started with siding with the workers, down with the Tsar, bread, peace, increasingly they supported the war. Increasingly, they sided with the bosses and held down wages. So the workers continued to go on strike. They continued to protest. They continued to say we're opposed to the war. And Lenin and Trotsky, Lenin to start with actually, he said actually we need to start saying we need to push the revolution further. We need to say all power to the Soviets. The workers should be put in control of society. The peasants and soldiers and workers Soviets should be put into control of society. And the Bolshevik Party played a really crucial role in those months, the revolutionary months, helping to support the resistance and help to point it in a direction that could lead it towards workers' revolution. However, even at that point, when it came to the insurrection in October 1917, where you do have a revolution that sees workers taking control, this was not called for by Lenin or by even the leading Bolsheviks. But it was called for by the Revolutionary Committee of the Soviets, of the Petrograd Soviet. And this was, again, that mass workers' council. And this body had been formed, in a few weeks before the insurrection. Now, it did have a majority of Bolshevik members, but that was because the workers themselves had been won to that position and had become involved in that struggle. And Trotsky, again, who'd only joined the Bolsheviks in August of 1917 in the heat of the revolution, he was the president of that Soviet. But it wasn't just the Bolsheviks either. It was left revolutionaries too who were part of that. So what I'm really trying to say is that the October Revolution was only ever able to happen because the Bolsheviks was a mass organization rooted in the working class, rooted amongst oppressed groups. Oh dear. Oh, I've got plenty to sum up on then. Okay, so, and that's really why they were able to win. Right. So as soon as there was revolution, there was counter-revolution, yeah? And this is how that society was built. It was built against the context of counter-revolution and civil war. And it was in the most, extremely difficult circumstances. Now, Trotsky and Lenin always said that the revolution needed to spread. It needed to spread to Germany and other neighboring countries where there were revolutions. But, unfortunately, ultimately, those revolutions, they failed. And while the Russian Revolutionary Army was able to win that civil war by 1922, it left revolutionary Russia very isolated, very impoverished. Whole industries were destroyed, production was very low, and it just decimated that working class who'd been so involved in the revolution of 1917. And so what you had was the Bolsheviks in control, increasingly, of a vast bureaucratic state in economic despair. And this is what led them in 1921 to put in place a new economic policy, which gave limited economic incentives to the peasants. Again, this increased growing tensions within the Bolsheviks. Now, Trotsky, around the left opposition, he still continued to argue for workers' control and workers' resistance. The right said we need to align ourselves with the wealthy peasants. And then the center around Stalin said, actually, no, what we need is socialism in one country. We need industrialization, industrialize. And this is where Stalin comes into power after the death of Lenin in 1923. He attempted to create these two opposed ideas of Leninism and Trotskyism. And this is despite Lenin having said, actually, what's going on in Russia right now is not really, this is like a workers' state, but with really bureaucratic distortions. Everyone was a bit confused about what exactly was going on, but they definitely were certain this is not socialism. This is not what we've been fighting for. And what you see is Stalin created his own bureaucracy, his own class around him from 1928 on with its own interests. And this failed economy led towards forced industrialization. Stalin said, we are 50 to 100 years behind the advanced countries. We have to make this all up in 10 years. So imagine you trying to do what it'd taken other industrialized countries over 100 years to do in 10 years. Say, right, we're going to go for it. This means completely subordinating the needs of people to the needs of accumulation. And as I've already talked about, anyone who dissented was silenced or liquidated. Now, again, Trotsky at the time even, he said, look, this could still be saved. Perhaps it's a degenerated workers' state. The bureaucracy has seized power, but the workers could still rise up and overturn them. Do I need to sum up? I've got a couple of minutes. Okay, cool. However, I think after World War II, what we saw was that Stalin then seized Eastern Germany, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, and Albania, and he seized all of them and said, all right, these countries are socialist too. But there'd never been any workers' struggle in them. There'd never been any resistance from below in them to overturn the bosses and so on. So how could they be any form of a workers' state? And this is where Tony Cliff, who's a founding member of the SWP, he defined, the Soviet Union as state capitalism. It was a capitalist country where the state acted more like the business class in a free market economy. And I think today, while some on the left will still kind of look at Trotsky's idea of the degenerated state and so on, really in the SWP, what we see is Stalinist countries, they're not socialist or communist, but they are state capitalist. And what state capitalism countries share as a key feature of class society is class division. They have the owning class versus the working class. Now, the bureaucracy may not own the means of production like a CEO may, but they do control and enjoy the privileges based on that control. You also have capitalist market competition, as Stalin increasingly competed on the imperial stage, rapid industrialization, and other countries. Russia was locked into economic and military competition with other capitalist states. And you have an arms race during the Cold War, which put the economy under increasing continuous pressure, okay? Of course, still many at the time held illusions with the Soviet Union. And I had more to say than I prepared, so I apologize. I'll come back to it in the summing up. But I guess what I'll end on saying is another key feature, though, of Stalinism that it shared with Western capitalism was that of struggle, and there was struggle against Stalinist countries and resistance, especially from 1953 on. If you look at the revolt in Hungary of workers who rose up again, was completely smashed, so showing the reactionary nature of the regime. And I think for the world really lifting that curtain and people being able to see on the left being able to see some of the realities of what were going on. I'd love to talk a bit about China and Cuba, but maybe we can come into it in discussion. And there's been meetings at Marxism, and will be more tomorrow, I know, on China, and I encourage people to go along to that. But ultimately, and I hope you'll just give me a minute so I don't end without this, is just say that, it was mass struggle and workers' struggle ultimately that also brought an end to Stalinism and Stalinist countries, whether that was East Germany in 1989 and then the Soviet Union in 1991. These were, revolutionary mass struggles from below. The West tried to say they were on the side of the revolution, but how could Reagan and Thatcher, who were union busters, be on the side of a revolution and struggle in Poland? Right, and I think really this shows us, what we're still fighting for today. What was left in these countries was actually now developing, bourgeois free market capitalism, which in no way has liberated people either. The same, people who were acting as the bureaucrats there turned into the bosses or the politicians and so on. So I think, while we shouldn't mourn the fall of the Soviet Union, we also need to look at the realities and say we have to go back to the history of 1917 and fight for workers' self-emancipation. And today capitalism is driving to disaster, climate, pandemic, nuclear war. We ask, what is socialism? How do we win it? Well, I just want to be clear, Stalinism is not that answer. I think it's the complete death of socialism, and that's why we need revolutionary politics based on mass struggle from below, and that's about all of us uniting for oppressed groups with workers against exploitation and for genuine liberation. And thank you, Chair.
I had 2 points I had in mind when I was listening to you speak. The first one was, it's interesting how actually parallel the development of sort of Stalin's Russia onwards, that kind of, like you say, sort of hyper-accelerated development parallels to the neoliberal reforms. And it's almost like he was sort of the OG neoliberal in a way. So that was the first thing. Secondly, I think to do with the question of why people sort of can kind of fall into these things of, this is cool and this particular, but I think there's a very sort of fundamental thing that people need to be aware of in themselves, regardless of where they fall on the political spectrum, which is a tendency towards leader worship that can very easily happen to any one of us. And people look to, they might start romanticise people like Stalin or Mao, for example, but also we can be just as susceptible, like, you might see it in people going, what's his face, the RMT guy. Mick Lynch, what a hero, and forget that actually it's a mass movement of workers that's going on, rather than looking at this figurehead at the top. That was pretty much my point.
You followed by you.
I would. Hi, I'm Cara. I would probably call myself a Marxist Leninist. I came to this meeting to see I personally would describe the USSR under Stalin was socialist, and I want to see how it responds to this. That's because the USSR, before Khrushchev's reforms, so the USSR never modified labour power, and the workers controlled production means and outputs, I would say, either directly on the agrarian collective or indirectly on the workers' controlled state, workers' run state would be the point. and commodity production did exist, but through United Socialist producers, there was no interperson exploitation and no hired labour. And say it's not really a mystery or some Stalinist takeover or Stalinist dictatorship, and I question the dictatorship description. Stalin attempted to resign 4 times, but it was rejected, and he couldn't do, but decided to continue because they wanted to keep him. He had a nomination from Lenin and ratification from the CCCP, and it's just continued with Stalinist bureaucracy and so on. And I think that it will be necessary because how else would collectives and state enterprise connect? Because if you did it by force straight from the beginning, moments after civil war, with a completely weakened and basically destroyed civil war, world war, and so on, and there was also not insignificant resistance to the collectivization, and about the global trade. Because they had pretty much no industry, they're coming from a feudal backwater. The West refused to recognise their currency after a short period.
Can you sum up?
There's no reserve army of labour, no right to hire and fire, private property, boom bust cycles are inherent in capitalism. The law of value didn't regulate the economy. And I just wonder why you'd describe it as non-socialist and would say that there was definitely negative about Stalin what he did, the deportations, for example, registry, and they allowed a fifth column to grow, which is why the purges occurred.
Okay.
Let's say one last thing.
Sorry to cut you off, comrade.
One sentence.
Sorry, I'm really sorry. We've got quite a lot of people. Go on, thanks. Comrade here, followed by comrade there.
Thank you. This might be a really long-winded question, and thank you for that really good summary.
Speak up.
Yeah, I'll try. Everyone hear me? Yeah. So my question is, given what we know in our revolutionary history, how do we combat reactionary forces when arguably we're in a more dire situation, in a situation of hyper-capitalism, hyper-imperialism? How do we combat figures like Stalin who go against everything that the movement stands for? That's really it. That might be a very hard question or easy question to answer. I'd just like to know.
Right, thank you, comrade. Sorry, you followed by the man in the white mask at the back.
I thought no discussion of how cool Stalinism is or not could be complete without mentioning what a hunky young man Stalin he's the original hipster. I don't know, but on a more serious note, maybe you could comment on his rise to power, maybe relating to his aesthetics, or maybe more seriously his personality traits or something like that. But
Thank you.
Yeah, look, I think this is a really important discussion to have, because I think at the heart of this question is what is our vision of socialism? And my vision of socialism is that famous quote from Marx, which is that the emancipation of the working class has to be the acts of the working class themselves. In other words, no one from above can liberate us, right? No politicians, no state. It has to be us through self-activity. And anyone who thinks that Stalin's regime was socialist has to, for me, answer these 2 questions. One is, after World War II, Stalin sits down with Churchill and Roosevelt, and he carves up Europe, and he takes Eastern Germany, Hungary, and Poland. None of those countries had a revolution, but suddenly they were socialist because the tanks rolled in. The Soviet tanks rolled in. How can that be? If socialism's from below in a revolutionary process, how can Poland one day not be socialist, and the next day, just because the Soviet Union control it, they're suddenly socialist? That, for me, is tin pot socialism. The second question we have to answer is, after the fall of the USSR in 1989, the leading figures in the state machinery of so-called socialism stepped sideways to become capitalists. Vladimir Putin's one of them. He was in the KGB. So leading figures in a so-called socialist regime, when it falls, suddenly they start making millions of pounds under capitalism. How are these people socialists? If these are the leaders of the socialist state, how can they do that? And therefore, at the heart of this question is we have to tell the truth. We have a saying in the SWP that you have to tell the truth about the political situation. You have to tell the truth about the revolution not happening tomorrow. You have to tell the truth about the state of working class struggle in Britain. You have to tell the truth about what is the nature of Stalinism. And it affects our vision for socialism today. It means that in trade unions, we have to fight often with Communist Party members who are way conservative and don't want strikes. It means in the Labour Party, we've argued not to join Labour Party, as a lot of Communist Party members did under Jeremy Corbyn. And it means, like the comrade just mentioned, we stand on the side of workers in China fighting for more workers' rights today against a state capitalist regime. So at the heart of this question, I think it's not just a historical thing, it's not about ticking boxes, it's what kind of vision of socialism we are fighting for today.
I don't really want to follow that motivational speech, but I think that I go to university in Glasgow where we have a huge young communist league presence, but they rarely show up a lot of the time. You don't see them on the streets all of the time, and I feel like that's the case with a lot of Stalinist organisations. You don't see a large amount of intervention. You see them a lot of May Day protests and whatnot. And I was complaining to a comrade. I was saying, if they're these revolutionaries or whatever, then why are they not out there on the streets intervening, trying to fight for revolution? And they said to me, well, they think it's already happened, which I think is actually a really crucial issue with all of these young people being sucked into the world of Stalinism and the world, these so-called communist parties, is that I do not wish to be deeply sectarian. I am a member of the SWP, but if lots of young people are brought to socialism, I think that's overall a good thing. I think lots of young people reading Marx is a very, very good thing. But if those young people feel like the revolution has already happened for them, or will happen on their behalf, or they will be given socialism and, a true socialist, world to them from above, then that means that they don't feel the need to intervene, that you don't need to be on the picket line, you don't need to be talking to people on the street about Marxism and about your ideology. And I think that's what's really worrisome about this ideology a lot of the time. If you are on the street, as I'm sure many people who are in the room who do SWP stores have, you will interact with people whose families suffered under the former Soviet Union, and therefore your whole ideology will eventually be crushed. I have never ever thought of myself possibly as a Stalinist because I grew up in multicultural London, where I grew up alongside several people whose families were from Eastern Europe. So it never crossed my mind to have such a thought. And I think that a lot of the time, if these young people were actually speaking on the street and active in a lot of spheres, that would totally change because you would have that experience of talking to someone. Yeah, I'm done now.
Thank you. A lot of the hands up. Comrade here, followed by person in the hat at the back.
Thank you, Eva. Okay, sorry, my English is very bad. It's my first time that I'm going to try to speak English, okay? Yes. Okay, I want to do one reflection, okay? Because it's difficult for me to have true ideas, okay? I don't have true ideas. Only questions. Okay? There are two antecedents. Stalin is polemic. Okay? It is a question polemic. It's a fight 1921 with respect at repression in Constant for part Lenin and Trotsky. Abolition of democracy in the Congress 10 in the same year. These two antecedents is problematic because, of course, Stalin did the same, no? No? Okay? This is the problem. Yes, it's said that this question is ascension. This was this ascension in the history for the civil war. No? But it is the problem really because in Grostan there was a working class fighting with their rights, democracy, bread. Do you understand me? More or less? Okay. Yes, it's a big mistake. This is okay. Eva, what do you say about that? Thank you.
Speaking as an older Trotskyist, I like to think that many of us were dashing in our youth. I want to start really with the way this debate is portrayed, because all too often I think there's an attempt to portray the rise of Stalin and the defeat of other visions of socialism in the Soviet Union as being about a personal argument between Leon Trotsky and Joseph Stalin. And I think we have to argue that there are material bases to the rise of Stalin and to what he attempted to do, and what indeed he did do in the Soviet Union. Almost exactly 100 years ago, 1928, which was the break with the first 5-year plan from any model, I think, of socialism from below. And we have to remember, as Emma said, the experience of the Civil War, a successful revolution from below, which seizes state power on behalf of by the workers. The workers control society. And actually, the massive defeat that the Civil War entails, the hollowing out of workers' organisation, indeed the destruction of the organised working class in its most central bastions, particularly in Petrograd and Moscow, the complete destruction of democracy in practice in the working class communities and workplaces. That is an absolutely devastating defeat for the working class. And really what happens at that point is there's a choice faced in society. Do you argue that you have to keep, despite the problems, fighting for international revolution, for successful revolutions elsewhere, or do you hollow it backwards and actually argue that you can build some form of state capitalist society inside Russia? And Stalin did the latter. And to do that, he had to physically liquidate anyone who argued for internationalism and defeat them where they tried to do that elsewhere. Think about the Spanish Civil War, the dead hand of Stalinism that literally allowed the counter-revolution and I think fascism to succeed. Why do these arguments matter today? Because actually, if you followed Stalin's logic, actually you can do it from the top down. You can do it through individual leadership. You don't need democratic planning of society by workers and the peasants. You don't need mass participated democracy. You can have a powerful leader from above. And that matters. The comrade who mentioned Mick Lynch is correct. If you have an orientation that says leaders matter and you don't focus on the rank and file, what do you do when the anti-leadership wobble? What do you do when those trade union bureaucracies might sell you out and you don't have an orientation on workers' power from below? The Trotskyist tradition, and I think the revolutionary tradition of the SWP, is to say emancipation from below is not just an abstract argument for when we're sitting in the pubs after demonstrations. It is an argument in the real here and now that is about how workers can win and how we can ultimately win liberation. And that's why you should be a revolutionary socialist and a Trotskyist and not a Stalinist.
That, who I'm afraid you will be the last speaker. I'm afraid we've got too many people, but please go on.
It's just a very small point about the 1917 revolution in itself, how you described it as a big revolution of all the workers coming up. But the Bolshevik Party were mainly known in just Moscow and St. Petersburg, when most of the workers were in very rural areas, and the peasants who hadn't even heard of the Bolsheviks and had only been recently emancipated from serfdom under Tsar Alexander. And the Bolsheviks are described as this massive movement and they were so powerful, but a lot of it was just luck and timing with the provisional government being so weak. And obviously it was meant as a temporary solution to the problem. And a lot of the Bolshevik takeover was just them being in the right place at the right time. And because when they took over, the Mensheviks and the SRs had walked out, so they didn't have opposition. And they just came in because Kerensky had left, and they managed to take over. And most people didn't even know who they were, the people who they were meant to be supporting, the workers, the peasants. That's my point, pretty much.
I'm really sorry to everyone who had their hands up. We just don't have time.
Yeah, I want to talk as someone who is from a former Stalinist regime of East Germany and whose parents and grandparents have lived in that regime. And I want to give one thing why I think Stalinism can or has renewed itself or rehabilitated itself a bit, and two small things about East Germany which I think show the nature of Stalinism a bit. The first thing is, I don't know anymore who the quote was about, but the quote, capitalism has regenerated or strengthened Stalinism more than Stalinism itself. That the capitalist restoration in these socialist countries has caused so much misery, so much problems. I mean, in East Germany, the unemployment rate went up to, I think, over 10%. The giant masses of workers who had striked against Stalinism and had wanted a different system were sacked. One big thing there was the potash miners in southern East Germany, it was one of the biggest industries of East Germany, and they were almost all just sacked by the new capitalist government. And we see that in many former Stalinist states, that the capitalist restoration is something that Stalinists can point to and say, yeah, there wasn't everything perfect, but look what it is now. And the other 2 points I wanted to make was one about there was no revolution in East Germany. There was none that brought the Stalinists to power, but there was the beginning of a genuine mass movement. When the communists and the anti-fascists came back from exile and out of the concentration camps, they started anti-fascist committees, which tried to do denazification on their own. The problem with that was that it was working a bit too well for the Allied troops, because they didn't really want all the Nazis out. They wanted quite a few of them in, actually, to help keep run the new state. So they essentially destroyed these anti-fascist committees, and Stalin was complicit in that. Yeah. And the last point I just wanted to make was that East Germany needed a lot of Western currency, and it made its Western currency by selling masses of products, especially tools, to the West to get Western currency to have a better bargaining on the table within the internal Eastern economy, in the Eastern Bloc, which I think is a very interesting point on the...
All right, well, I just really first off just want to say thanks everyone for that discussion. I think it was really interesting, and clearly there's a lot of ideas out there, and that we need to go away and continue having these discussions. I want to point everybody also towards this book by Thomas Tangley Evans, The Shadow of Stalin. Sorry if I'm replacing something the chair is going to do, but it's an absolutely fantastic pamphlet which really addresses a lot of the arguments that we've been having in this room today. And you guys, I guess my starting point really what I want to start with really is, I know that over here we heard a comrade say, I'm a Marxist-Leninist. And I'd say, actually, in the SWP and the International Socialist Tendency, we'd say, absolutely, we are Marxists, we are Leninists. But we add to that, we're Trotskyists, we're Luxemburgists, we're Gramsciists. we're cliffists. And actually, we stand in this tradition of seeing revolutionary socialism from below. And that is the true Leninist Marxist tradition. Stalin was, fantastic at what we'd call today fake news, doctoring things, forcing there to be protests in support of him on his birthday or whatever, kind of canonizing him and so on. He also canonized Lenin and put up big statues of Lenin and so on, which, never existed during the revolutionary years of 1917 through to 1920-21, and when Lenin then died. And I don't know about a nomination from Lenin, but I do know that Lenin was actually very critical of where revolutionary Russia was going and very concerned. And I think, the comrade who talked about seeing the rise of Stalin not as some personality thing, he was actually sideline to the revolution, really. I mean, he was a member, he kind of was there as a member of the Bolsheviks for quite a long time, but he'd always been kind of a sideline figure, maybe doing some more of the admin tasks and that sort of thing. And actually, during the revolution, he actually voted against and at first opposed insurrection. He was also part of a group within the Bolsheviks leadership that before Lenin returned during the February Revolution of 1917, that he actually argued that they needed to be siding more closely with the provisional government and not arguing for there to be a continuation of the revolution. So he kind of would consistently play a conservative role within the leadership of the Bolsheviks. And it was only when, this period of horrific economic crisis and, really in many ways the tragedy of the new economic policy, and you started to see this developing bureaucracy. And, again, it's not to say that it's automatic that if we continued to struggle from below, that they would have necessarily been able to overthrow the Stalinist bureaucracy. But certainly this Stalinist bureaucracy did not lead anywhere towards socialism. What it led towards is what really we're talking about here. It's state capitalism. And this is the idea that really the institutions of these states mirror that of capitalism. The difference is the profits are going to the state rather into the hands of the bosses. And in order to maintain a system like that, there needs to be quite high levels of state control. Okay, and I think that's what I do think that, what we see in China today is, a highly centralized bureaucratic state capitalism, that is increasingly, neoliberal as well, playing a part on a global stage. And we've seen that as well in Cuba. There's been increasingly, opening up to neoliberalism. And actually, before the fall of the Soviet Union as well, there was increasingly opening up to big business and so on. And so I'd say, the same goes in China. You have a mass working class, one of the biggest mass working class, highly oppressed, extreme nationalism. And then we also know that we have this is, concentrated through the oppression of minority groups, for example, the Uyghur Muslims. And while, some of the early ideas of the Communist Party in China kind of shared the vision of 1917 and so on, actually that current was destroyed, and actually was destroyed by the rise of Stalin. Stalin actually argued for holding back the struggle of revolutionary workers and so on in China. So, I think when it comes to what we're fighting for today, the fact that people are questioning the system and starting to look to different types of ideas, this is a really good thing. We want people to be questioning imperialism, questioning capitalism, reading Marx, reading Lenin. But as I said, we want people to be reading Trotsky and Gramsci and Luxemburg and beyond as well, Kollontai. And we want to be looking to that genuine revolutionary alternative from below, because ultimately these Stalinist organizations and Stalinism as an ideology, it's the death of socialism. It's the death of the idea that actually workers and oppressed groups have to do it for themselves. Not only can we, if we are going to win socialism, we have to do it for ourselves. Nobody can do it on our behalf. And unfortunately, those who own and control the means of production have no interest in it. And even some of those leaders and organizers of the working class, as has been mentioned, for example, the trade union bureaucrats and so on, they might be up for leading a struggle up to a certain point. However, ultimately, their role as well is in negotiating between capitalism and the workers, aren't they? And they have to work within that system. And ultimately, oftentimes the bureaucrats will end up playing a conservative role in holding back struggle So what happens when we reach that point? What do we do? Where do workers look to? And that's why we need independent, revolutionary, socialist organisation which roots itself in the trade unions, works together with anybody on the left who wants to fight in united fronts against racism, fascism, war, climate emergency, sexism, but at its heart says the system has completely failed and is not able to deliver for us. We actually need to fight for something much bigger, and that's socialism. And so really that's what our project is in the Socialist Workers' Party. And so I'd really urge anyone who's here is come along to our meeting, to get stuck in, join the Socialist Workers' Party and be part of that fight for socialism from below. Thanks everyone for coming.